And then I would say the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. I am extremely excited at this opportunity to share some of the work I've been doing over the last couple of years. Now, I am really interested in the interactions between attention and reward value. And as many of you know, these have been huge cornerstones in the fields of psychology for many, many decades now. But historically speaking, research in these areas have progressed in relative isolation, with researchers really focused only on their narrow set of things. It wasn't until the last decade or so where researchers on both sides began to look to their colleagues and counterparts for new ideas and techniques to inform their own research. And the effects of this have been tremendous. For example, attention researchers have found that reward-associated stimuli can grab our attention in ways that defy traditional dichotomous theories of attention, and have gone on to radically reshape how they think about attentional influences. Conversely, decision scientists have become really interested in how attention can shape, perhaps even causally, decision-making itself, and have gone on to incorporate many measures of attention into their own models. Now, this work has been tremendous, but so far, I think it's still a little bit in its infancy, where researchers tend to only focus on one side of this interaction, and either how rewards can shape attention or how attention can shape decision-making. I approach it a little bit differently by studying both sides of these attention and reward interactions. I'm going to give 3 different examples of what I mean by this today. So in study 1, I'm going to talk about how rewards can shape attention. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about value-driven salience, a phenomenon that describes how our attention can be involuntarily drawn towards reward-associated stimuli. I'm going to talk about the neuromechanisms underlying this process. I'm then going to talk about, in study 2, value-driven salience in a different form of attention, sustained spatial attention, and talk about it in a task-irrelevant manner with distractions rather than a task-relevant manner. And in study 3, I'm going to talk about the other side of this interaction, about how attention can influence decision-making. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about how attention might be detrimental to decision-making in certain contexts, and specifically with attentional distractors. But with that little preview out of the way, I want to go ahead and start talking about study 1. We're going to talk about the neuromechanisms underlying value-driven salience. Now, I want to back up for a second and talk about a phenomenon called value-driven attentional capture, which describes how our attention can be involuntarily drawn to reward-associated stimuli in our environment. Now, in the real world, there's all sorts of examples of reward-associated stimuli, and one of the examples that I'll kind of bring to mind for you is brand logos. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that go into the design of brand logos, but it's also fair to say that one of the goals of these companies is for you to have a rewarding experience with their products. They want you to associate that rewarding experience with that logo, so that the next time you're out and about in the world and you come across this logo, you'll recall that rewarding experience and maybe be more likely to use their product once again. Now, in the lab, obviously, we simplify this quite a bit. We might do something like teach participants to associate this color blue with some sort of monetary reward. And the common task that we measure this in is called a visual search task, where participants have to search an array, find the one surrounded by a blue shape in this example, and then respond to the orientation of the line. Now, obviously, the cognitive processes involved in visual search are quite complex, but like any good cognitive scientist, I've been able to break it down into a series of boxes and arrows. Now, early on, when you're first learning to associate this color blue with this monetary reward, nothing really interesting is going to happen. But with repeated presentations, when you learn that these two things are associated with each other, you'll see something interesting start to occur the next time you encounter this blue shape. This should evoke a stronger attentional orienting response towards it. And because of this stronger attentional orienting response, this should go on to have ramifications upon how you process the actual target, as well as the actual behavioral response too. Now, this idea in which associating this color blue with money allows you to have a higher attentional priority for the color blue is what we're calling value-driven salience today. Now, there's a lot of really cool characteristics about value-driven salience. To me, the coolest part is that it involuntarily biases attention. So it can be helpful or hurtful, depending whether it's tied to a task-relevant or task-irrelevant stimulus. The effects are also relatively fast. We know they're certainly much faster than top-down attentional control, and you can see these effects relatively early on in sensory cortices. Now, many of these characteristics of value-driven salience are very similar to that of another modifier of salience, physical salience. Now, physical salience is born from the actual sensory information of a stimulus and how they contrast to the world around them. So, for example, this red, that I've been told is a tulip, has a high degree of physical salience because the red stands out into a stark contrast to the yellow around it. There's nothing inherently special about the red color on its own, and there's nothing that we had actually learned about it. It has to do with the sensory contrast. But objects having physical salience evoke many of the same characteristics of value-driven salience. They involuntarily bias attention in helpful or hurtful ways. The effects are relatively fast, and we can also see these effects in sensory cortices as well. So this led some people to suggest, well, if they have similar characteristics, perhaps they rely upon the same neuromechanisms as well. But others have pushed back on this idea by pointing out that value-driven salience is a learned process, while physical salience is not. And so, therefore, there must be differences in the neuromechanisms underlying them. But truth be told, there really hadn't been any empirical or clarifying what these exact neural differences might be, if they did exist at all. And this became the thrust of his particular study. So we want to look at the neuromechanisms underlying value-driven salience and see if they were similar or different of that of physical salience. We accomplish this by selectively manipulating both forms of salience and then measuring how they impacted cognitive processing. Now, we took several different event-related potentials to kind of index some of these markers of cognitive processing, and we measured the speed, aka the latency, as well as the strength, amplitude of each of these. We looked at the N100, which you can think of as a marker of early sensory processing, the N2PC, which is a marker of attentional orienting, and the P300, which can be loosely thought of as evaluative target processing. Now, we had different hypotheses for objects that were high in physical salience versus value-driven salience. With physical salience, our hypotheses are pretty straightforward based off of a lot of past research. We expected that objects that were high in physical salience should be easier to find, so you should have earlier attentional orienting as indexed by a faster N2PC, as well as faster reaction times too. With value-driven salience, we expected to see similar behavioral outcomes where targets at a high degree of value-driven salience should be faster to respond to, but it was unclear what the effects on attentional orienting might be. One possibility, of course, is that if it relies on similar neuromechanisms, we might expect to see an earlier N2PC as well. But obviously, if something was different, then anything was really possible. So in order to test this, we had participants complete a visual search task where they had to covertly search an array of colored ellipses, find the colored pop-out target, and respond to its orientation, either horizontal or vertical. Now, targets came in three different types of colors, and they were specifically chosen to vary in degree of physical salience. So one of the colors was chosen to have a high degree of physical salience relative to the surrounding array. The other two colors were chosen to have a low degree of physical salience, but critically to have an equivalent amount of physical salience relative to one another. So that's how we manipulated physical salience. What about value-driven salience? Well, we did this by changing the reward associations to each target in different blocks of a study. So in the first baseline block, participants just completed the task as is with no reward manipulation. So within this block, we could look at high versus low differences in physical salience with no value-driven salience. In the next equal reward block, we started to give participants a small amount of money every time they completed the task or the trial correctly and sufficiently quickly. But we gave them the same amount of money for every target type. So here, we could again look at high versus low physical salience with the same amount of value-driven salience, but also look at changes across the block to see how adding in this reward incentive would change cognition. But things get really cool in the final selective reward block, because there we took one of the two low physical salience targets and gave it so that it had a 10 times larger payoff than that of everything else. So within this block, we could again look at high versus low physical salience while controlling for the same amount of value-driven salience, and high versus low value-driven salience while equating for the same amount of low physical salience. So let's look at some of the behavioral results. So first, looking at the baseline block where there's no reward manipulation, we found that participants were significantly faster for the high physical salience target compared to the two low physical salience targets. This is just a sanity check to make sure this is working properly. We obviously expected this would happen. People should be able to find this target faster. When we added in the reward incentive and the equal reward block, we found that it resulted in a decrease of reaction times across the board. But critically, this change in reaction time was the same for each target type, and people are still responding significantly faster for the high physical salience target. Finally, in the selective reward block, we took what I'm going to be plotting as the color blue here and gave it a 10 times larger payoff to give it more value-driven salience. And what we found is that this led to a further decrease in reaction time. In fact, at this point, there's no significant difference between the high value target and the high physical target. So it's similar behavioral outcomes like this that led some people to suggest that maybe they rely upon similar neuromechanisms as well. But now let's look at the data to actually see what's happening. So I'm going to start off with data from the baseline block and kind of step through each of these ERPs in turn, the N100, then the N2PC, and then the P300. So first, we're going to look at the N100. If you are not very familiar looking at EEG plots, the x-axis is going to have time in milliseconds. The y-axis is going to be amplitude with a positive going up. I've highlighted the ERP that we're focusing in this yellow box here, and there's obviously a different trace for each target type. Now, what may jump out to you looking at this is that there's no differences at all between these N100s. This is actually great. This is another sanity check for us. Even though we had chosen these colors to specifically vary in degree of physical salience, we had specifically and carefully chosen them to have the same amount of sensory information. Because again, physical salience is built from a contrast of other stimuli. So this is just to make sure that there's no low-level sensory biases that might be affecting our results. Moving on to the N2PC, what we found is that the N2PC for the high physical salience target is occurring significantly faster than that of the two low physical salience targets. This is, again, great. It replicates previous findings. It's just, again, reflecting that people can orient to this high physical salient target faster. But notably, there's no significant difference between the amplitudes of these N2PCs. And then moving on to the P300, we found once again that the P300 for the high physical salience target is occurring significantly earlier in time, but there's no difference in the amplitude of these P300s. I'll also point out that some people think this difference is very small. Just to explain that, I have expanded this x-axis of time by quite a bit, so this difference just looks visually smaller at this point, but this effect is statistically significant. All right, so this is what happens when there's no reward manipulation. What happens when we add in that reward manipulation and start giving them a small amount of money for every correct response? Well, looking back at the N100, we found that it resulted in an increase in the amplitude of N100s across the board. And just in case you might forget what it looked like in the previous plot, this little bar indicates where the N100s were in the previous block. But critically, this amplitude increase is the same for each target type, and there's still no differences in the speed of these N100s. So we think this just reflects adding in this reward motivation and incentive that people are just basically trying much harder at this point to do the task well. We see a similar pattern happen when we look at the N2PC. The amplitude is increased for all target types, but people are still responding significantly faster for the high physical salience target. And then, once again, a similar pattern for the P300. There's an increase in amplitude across the board, but people are still responding significantly faster for the high physical salience target. This is all well and good, but let's finally talk about the fun block, where we increase the value of one of these targets to be 10 times larger than that of everything else. So, does this have an effect upon the N100? Well, it seems like the answer to that is no. We actually see no differences in this block compared to the last block. So value-driven salience does not seem to have a specific impact upon early sensory processing. But we do see some interesting stuff happen when we look at the N2PC. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this plot. And let's start off by talking about what happens for the high-value target. Increasing the value of this target results in a significantly larger N2PC, a strikingly larger one compared to both of the two low-value targets. But The high physical target, even though it's smaller in amplitude, is still occurring significantly earlier in time. So just to reinforce what we're finding here, we're finding that increasing the value-driven salience of a target results in a stronger attentional orienting response, as indicated by an increase in N2PC activity. While conversely, the high physical salience target is resulting in a faster attentional orienting response that isn't necessarily changing the strength of that response. So very cool. It suggests that there's differences in the neuromechanisms underlying attentional orienting here. But what happens later on with target processing? Well, here we find something quite surprising. So as you recall, in every plot leading up to this, we found that P300 for the high physical salience target was occurring significantly earlier in time because it was simply being oriented to faster. Now we find that the high value target is exactly the same speed as a high physical target. And this is despite the fact that different things are happening in attentional orienting. So somehow, and then we're not exactly sure yet how, there is some sort of catch-up mechanism that allows this stronger but slower attentional orienting response to result in faster target processing and then later on faster behavioral responses as well. But this is where I'm going to go ahead and conclude this study for now. We found that value-driven salience modulated the strength but not speed of attentional selection, while physical salience modulated the speed but not strength of attentional selection, suggesting that although both of these different forms of salience lead to similar behavioral outcomes, they utilize different neuromechanisms to achieve this. One of the reasons why I think this finding is particularly critical is because there's been lots of research coming out recently that have shown the real-life ramifications of reward-associated stimuli having negative impacts, particularly in clinical settings. Particularly drug addicts seem to have a stronger involuntary attentional response to drugs and drug cues. And treatments on this particular attentional or biasing effect have not been very effective so far. I think in part because we've done a poor job of elucidating what makes this attentional bias unique, particularly at a neural level. I have some conjectures of what I think about is happening with that, but that might have to also be a story for future work too. But now I want to go ahead and keep moving along and talk about study 2, where we're going to talk about value-driven attentional capture again, but this time, instead of talking about in the task-relevant context, to talk about it with distractors instead, and to talk about the different form of attention as well, sustained spatial attention. So value-driven salience, if you look through the literature, would suggest it has incredibly widespread effects upon cognition and behavior. For example, value-driven salience can be born from associating rewards with all sorts of different things. Simple features like colors, lines, shapes, all the way up to very complex things like exemplars from categories of people and cars and trees. Although in the lab, we typically study on very short timescales on the order of seconds or minutes, some research has also shown that it can persist for much longer periods of time as well, on the order of days and perhaps even months. And although we typically talk about this as being a visual phenomena, there's been work showing that can also exist in other forms of sensory modalities too, like audition and olfaction. And this will give us this impression that value-driven salience can grab our attention all around the world in basically any circumstances to anything. But one caveat to this is that 99% of this work has really been focused on what happens during attentional search. And less has looked at how attention, when channeled to other forms, might be affected by this. Now, this is critical because other forms of attention can have negative effects from distraction as well, but we don't know really the effects of reward-related distraction and if it results in even greater decrements. So this leads to this very simple question of, can reward-related distraction still occur when we aren't actively searching our environment? So for a real-life analog, what I mean here, let's talk about an example. For example, when I'm driving down a highway, I'll frequently come across reward-associated stimuli in my environment, and what I mean by this is billboards. Now, obviously, advertising companies spend huge amounts of money specifically to try and make you associate these things with reward and to grab your attention from the road in front of you and onto them. To them, that's a success. Now, we can imagine circumstances where these billboards might be particularly effective when we're searching our environment. Like, let's say that I'm hungry and I'm looking for a place to eat. Maybe I'll pay especially more attention to these word-related billboards. What about when we aren't actively searching out an environment? What if we're just focusing our attention in a sustained manner to the road in front of us? Will we still be impacted by these reward-related distractors? So again, this is the main question for this particular study. We did think that distractors that have been associated with large rewards lead to greater decrements in sustained spatial attention. In order to study this, we had participants complete 2 tasks. In the first task, we had participants learn and maintain word associations with different colored squares. And then we reintroduced these colored squares in the second task, a sustained spatial attention task, and introduce them as distractors and assess their impact upon sustained spatial attention using EEG. So let's talk about the first reward learning task. So participants completed a reward oddball task where they had to fixate onto the central fixation cross and covertly attend to a stream of rapidly appearing colored squares that appeared just below fixation. They were told to ignore any of the frequent black squares and respond to the location of any of the 3 colored target squares. Now, each of these colored targets were associated with a different size reward, either a large reward, a small reward, or 0 points. And they would get this if you completed the task correctly and responded sufficiently quickly. Now, the main goal of this task was obviously for them to associate each of these colors with this large, small, and 0 reward. But just to go ahead and point out, although this task is very simple, it is still very challenging because it moves very quickly. Each of these squares only appeared on the screen for only 33 milliseconds, so basically 2 frames of our responder's refresh rate. So the goal of this was to teach people to associate these colored squares. What about the sustained spatial attention task? Well, for this, we borrowed what's called an RSVP task. And in these tasks, participants had to fixate on the central fixation cross and covertly attend to a steadily changing stream of characters that appeared right above fixation, and respond to any infrequently appearing numbers that appeared. Now, these characters change at a steady rate. This is going to be a key impact for how we did our EEG measurements, and they change every 150 milliseconds. So it's still a relatively fast task, and people have to really focus on making sure that they can find other targets. Now, periodically, we reintroduced one of these colored squares as a distractor in this task. Participants knew that these were task irrelevant. Each of the 3 target colored squares could appear. They could also appear on either the left or right-hand side, and they also appeared for the same duration and time, only 33 milliseconds. So because they appeared for a smaller window of time, this meant that these colored squares could appear anywhere throughout the task. They could appear during a non-target or a target. They could appear at the same start time as a new stimulus. They could appear partway through it. They could even overlap to the next one as well, and so on and so on. Now, one of the things that we were concerned about was that if we just had participants complete this task, we were worried that they might extinguish this learned reward association to these colored squares when they were no longer relevant. So in order to try and circumvent this, we had a specific block order where we first had participants complete several blocks of the reward learning task, and then start to rotate between their sustained spatial attention task and another block of the reward learning task, just in a certain maintenance phase to make sure they tried to maintain these reward association. On the next slide, I'm going to show you some data that looks at how well they maintain these word associations relative to the learning blocks as well. So let's go ahead and jump into that now. So first, we want to look for behavioral evidence that people were indeed learning these word associations to each colored target. And we found behavioral evidence that strongly supported this idea. People were significantly faster for the large reward category compared to the small and 0 reward category. We also looked for neural evidence to support this hypothesis as well, and found that when locked to the onset of a new colored, each of these target stimuli, that it resulted in a significantly larger P300 for the large reward condition. This nicely dovetails with past research, showing that the P300 is sensitive to reward magnitude and becomes larger in size when you have higher rewards. So this was all taken from the learning block, the first couple ones they did before they encountered the sustained spatial attention task. What happens during the maintenance blocks? Do they still maintain these things over time? Behavioral evidence indicated, Yes, they did. And neural evidence also pointed towards the same thing as well. There's similar relationships where people are responding significantly faster and having significantly larger P300s. So it's great. We accomplished our main goal with this particular task. Now let's talk about sustained spatial attention. And before I show you the results for that, I want to explain the particular measure we use to index sustained spatial attention. So we took a measure called the SSVEP, the Steady State Visual Evoked Potential, which is a really big mouthful of words to basically say that when you encounter a steadily changing stream of stimuli, there will be an entrained evoked oscillatory response in your sensory cortices that reflects the exact frequency rate of these changing stimuli. So for example, if in the top left box, I showed you a slowly changing but steadily changing rate of stimuli, and I looked inside your visual cortex, I would see a oscillatory response that exactly matched this changing frequency rate. If I showed you a different one, this time at a faster rate, I would expect to see another SSVEP, but again, reflecting this new changing oscillatory rate. Now, critically, the SSVEP has been found to be sensitive to attention. So the power of the SSVEP will become larger when you're actively attending to the stream. It'll become smaller when you are not attending to it too. Now, just to go ahead and say, I'm not going to be showing data that looks like a sinusoid. I'm going to be showing data that looks like that is the power of the specific SSVEP frequency that's tied to the rate of the changing stimuli in the task. So let's first look at the data about how the sustained spatial attention changes as a function of no distractors versus any distractors. And this is what the data looks like. Now, I first want to start off by discussing this unassuming line up here. This is the SSVEP power when we are looking at that when there's no distractor on the screen. And this is just another nice sanity check to show that basically, if you aren't being distracted, data, your sustained spatial attention continues just like hang out in the same sort of way. But obviously, you have dramatic results whenever you introduce the distractor. Whenever the distractor is introduced, it results in a big decrease in sustained spatial attention that peaks around 300 milliseconds and takes several hundred more milliseconds to return to baseline. Now, this finding really nicely dovetails with some past work we've done in our lab that have shown a similar pattern of effects. But now the question is, does this change as a function of the reward associations of a distractor? And to our surprise, we did not find this effect. In fact, there seemed to really be no difference between these three conditions. So we did two additional things here to basically continue to test out this conclusion. The first one is that when we initially did these analyses, we used frequentist statistics, which obviously are not capable of determining whether there's truly no difference between these conditions. So we went back and first tested the peak of this dip of sustained attention with Bayesian analyses to see if they support a null hypothesis. And there was substantial evidence indicating that there is truly no difference between these three conditions, at least at the peak here. The other thing that eagle-eyed viewers might notice is that it looks like there could be some difference between the large and the small and zero reward later on in time, maybe suggesting that large reward distractors take longer to get back to baseline. We did some other targeted analyses here and found that the Bayesian analyses actually suggested evidence towards the null hypothesis once again, but the evidence was much weaker. So we can tentatively say that there is still no difference between these categories here, but I should clarify that future research should go ahead and see if they can replicate this effect. So what did we learn from this? Well, we learned the physical introduction of a distractor, obviously led to disruptions of sustained spatial attention. But to our surprise, the magnitude of this disruption was not sensitive to the distractor's word associations. Now, just to be clear, I think we can rule out a couple of confounds that people might be concerned about, and particularly this idea that maybe this extinguished the learned response. I think our earlier data looking at the maintenance blocks does support the idea that it's not just simply that. Instead, I think that this indicates a really important boundary condition to this idea of value-driven salience. And specifically, based on some comparisons to other literature, I think that sustained spatial attention might be more resistant to reward-related distraction compared to attentional search. And that it might have a greater impact when that reward-related distractor is already within your field of the attentional spotlight. Now, I also want to back up and talk about the car and driving example as well, because our intuition was that reward-related distractors, even in the real-life circumstances, had negative impacts upon driving behaviors. And what we found is actually that real-life evidence does actually support this idea that the physical salience of a distractor can have a bigger impact, but that the reward-related distractor may have a lesser one. In fact, if you look at the rate of car crashes that are related to distractions in the real world, 95% of them don't come from the external environment. 95% of them come from within the car. So a much smaller proportion of things happen due to external events like billboards. And billboards have greater impacts when they're already closer into the road and are already closer to your existing sustained spatial attention. But that's where I want to go ahead and wrap up study 2. And I want to quickly move through study 3, where we look at the other side of this relationship by looking at how attention can influence decision-making. Now, historically, people have asked and studied questions like, how do people choose between eating an apple and eating an orange, using various computational models. And in particular, things like the drip diffusion model, which measure this as an accumulation of evidence over time until eventually it reaches some bound to trigger the motor response to select either an apple or an orange. Now, this evidence accumulation process is very sensitive to the dynamics of, in this case, value differences. For example, I strongly prefer apples over oranges. So if we did a drip diffusion model on myself, it'd be modeled as a noisy accumulation of evidence towards the apple. Now, this was the predominant model of decision-making until about a decade or so ago, when people began to point out that these models inherently assumed that people were simultaneously attending to every single option on the screen at the same time and gathering information about them at the same time as well, which is not a realistic description of how people make decisions here. People look at one item, they look at another item, and they may look back and forth between the items and then make a decision. And so they began making new computational models that reflected this process. And more specifically, they came up with this idea that attention might actually be biasing this accumulation of evidence. So if I began by looking at the orange, evidence accumulation would begin building up more towards the orange. Then I go ahead and move my attention over to the apple and I'm done. It began to move to be biased towards the apple, and it would continue to go back and forth until basically one of these boundaries had been met and I could make my decision. This really had a huge impact on changing the field of decision-making. And nowadays, it's become increasingly common to use measures of visual attention to help predict choice. A couple key ones that I'll highlight are things like first fixation. We tend to choose the item that we look at first. Also, things that receive more gaze time also tend to be chosen over the other. And then we also tend to look at the object that we want to choose right before we fix it, right before we select it as well. And like I said, computational models of choice have also been upgraded in many different forms to include measure of attention too. But as somebody with more of an attention background, I have noticed that many of these tasks test attention in circumstances where people can really only fully focus on the task at a time in the current set of options. There aren't really anything else to attend to in these very pared down tasks. So a real life analog of these things might be going to a restaurant, looking through a menu, looking at each option, and then when you make your selection, you order. But obviously, when we go to a restaurant, our experience is much more complex than that. It's full of noisy distractions. We might look up from the menu several times to glance at the loud, noisy table next to us, or to our attention is caught by a waiter or waitress dashing nearby with a huge plate full of food. Or maybe we just look up from time to time to converse with our dining partner. Our current understanding of attention decision-making doesn't have room to describe how these changes of attention, where you move entirely away from the task set, can impact decision-making. So this became the idea of this particular study goal. If attention is highly predictive of choice, what happens when our attention is shifted to something irrelevant partway through decision-making? And if there is an impact of this, how does it impact the processes underlying this? This is some really new data that I have, and so we have some results from behavioral and eye tracking measures. I do have some stuff to say about computational measures later on during the Q&A period if people are interested in that as well. One last thing of background I want to give as well is there's been some work also suggesting that there might be different phases of attention across a choice. So that early shifts of attention might be more focused on gathering an overview of options. More middle ones might be more focused on comparing the value of each option. And then the last final fixation might be used as sort of a final check to make sure that you do want the option before selecting it. And so based off of this idea, there might be differences in attention across the course of a trial. We also ended up collecting 2 different samples, each with 50 subjects, where we tested each of these different hypotheses. One where we distracted people during their first fixation, which we thought would reflect interrupting this gathering and overview of option. And a second sample where we distracted people during the second fixation, which we thought might be starting to tap into this comparison of values. So to get into the task, we first had people come in and give us some ratings on 40 different snack food items they saw on the screen in front of them. And these snack foods varied in a number of different dimensions. Like taste, we had things that generally people like, things like candy bars, chips, trail mix, all the way down to things that most people typically don't like to eat so much, like cold canned vegetables, or sardines and oil, and other things like that. They also varied in the degree of health as well. So obviously we had things that were unhealthy, like junk food. We also had things that would be seen as more healthy, like fresh fruits, low-fat snacks, other things like that too. So the main measure I want to talk about here is we asked them to rate these things on how much they wanted to eat those items, from positive values all the way down to negative values and neutral between. After that, we had participants complete a binary choice task where they had to look at 2 different food items and select which one they would rather eat. So in the circumstance, I have a sweet tooth and I would choose to eat Oreo cookies over trail mix. Now, in order to really incentivize people to think carefully about what they'd rather eat, we had them come in after they had fasted for 4 hours and told them that at the end of a study, we were going to give them one of their choices, and we would ask them to eat it before they would be allowed to leave. So they should be motivated to choose something that they actually want to eat, particularly because they were hungry. Now, in both samples, we divided trials into 2 different trial types that were intermixed with one another. 2/3 of trials went into the no distractor condition, where participants just completed a task like this. They had 4 seconds to make their selection before moving on to the next trial. And the other part of the trials, it was in the distractor condition, where you introduce a distractor partway through either their first fixation or second fixation, depending on which version of the study they were in. So just to give you an idea about this, let's pretend that we're in version 1, where we interrupt people during the first fixation. The trial would begin. Let's say that I begin looking at Doritos, and before I finish my first fixation on that, these food items are going to disappear, and in the center, I'm going to put a distractor like that. I'm going to back up and show this one more time to show you what the identity of this was. It's going to flash up on the screen and disappear and allow you to continue with the task. Now, let's talk about what we did with these distractors. Our goal for this was for them to be highly salient, to grab your attention, be brief, last only for a couple 100 milliseconds, and disrupt attention partway through the trial on either their first or second fixation, again, depending on the version of a study that they went through. But there were a couple of key manipulations that we used for this. First off, we made sure that the distractor images were as low arousing and neutral as possible by selecting them from the IAPS dataset. And I worked really hard to make sure that arousal, which we know has different effects upon attention, couldn't conflate any of the eye tracking results that we saw here, or had as little of an impact as possible. I also want to pause here and also talk about how I'm differentiating distractors in this study from interruptions, which is another literature that I think some of you may be familiar with. Interruptions, I'll define as basically having a primary task, and then there is a new secondary task that appears that you have to complete before you can return to the primary task. So think about as like you're responding to an email and then a phone call comes in that you have to answer. We want to avoid any sort of intermediary tasks like that, because that can again have effects upon arousal. In this case, we were very narrowly interested in effects on attention in this case. And then lastly, we did warn participants that something like this was going to happen. We told them that were basically advertisements, but we assured them that they weren't going to relate to their food options. They can just continue making their choices normal. One thing that I omitted to say is that you may be wondering how we could be so precise as to interrupt them through either the first or second fixation. We accomplished this by measuring their eye movements live during each trial so that we could specifically insert the distractor in either the first or second fixation. So the average fixation in these studies tends to be about 200 or 300 milliseconds. So using the live eye tracking measures, we can insert the distractor as soon as they had looked at something for about 100 milliseconds, so about halfway through a typical fixation in this case. So we had different hypotheses for each of these measures of behavior on eye tracking. We thought that distractors would cause people to take longer to make a decision, and their choices would be less consistent with their self-reported wanting ratings in the first task. Essentially, that their choices become noisier. For the eye tracking measures, there's a couple of things that we were interested in particular. So first, I was really curious about what would happen after someone was distracted. So let's keep in mind that we're intending to distract them partway through a fixation. And we expect them to look at the attentional distractor as soon as it appears on the screen. And in 85 to 95% of trials, people do exactly this. They go from looking at where the food item used to be and looking at the distractor for some period of time. The question is, where do they look at next? One possibility is they look back at the disrupted food item to, quote unquote, finish processing it. Well, alternatively, the other option might be, well, I had enough information from this last thing. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other thing I don't know as much about. The other question we had with the eye tracking data was trying to see if it had any impact on the relationship between attention and choice. And in the data that I have today, I'm going to focus on the relationship between first fixation and choice, where again, people tend to choose the first time that they fixate on in many samples. We thought that it may disrupt this relationship, but that the way this might play out might change the function as when the distractor might be inserted, either in the first fixation or the second fixation. So I'm going to quickly go through a couple highlights from the results so far. And first, I want to talk about reaction time in this sample. So I'm going to show data from sample 1, where they looked at the first fixation, next to sample 2 in the second fixation. And I'm just going to do qualitative comparisons between the two of them. On the x-axis, I have differences in food wanting ratings between the left item and the right item. So objects that are, or items that are more positive on the scale, the left food option has a higher degree of wanting rating, while options that are on the right food has a higher degree of food wanting rating. So here's the data from the no distractor condition. We see a beautiful U-shaped curve in both of these conditions. This matches what we would expect to see. People tend to be faster when either the left food or the right food dominates the value of the other one, and they tend to slow down as the difference in wanting rating becomes smaller between the two. This is just reflecting choice difficulty, basically, at this point. When we looked at the data from the distractor trials, we found an extremely small difference in reaction time between these two conditions. The difference is only about 20 milliseconds or so. And just to be clear, we've adjusted this reaction time to subtract out the amount of time the distractor was on the screen. So I think this small difference in reaction time just comes from the fact that extra saccades were available because they had to fixate onto or they typically fixated upon the attentional distractor and then back to a food item. But something more interesting happens when we distracted people during the second fixation. Now it results in a much larger slowdown of speed in these distractor trials. And there's interaction with food wanting ratings as well, where the difference is much larger when the choice should have been easier in some circumstance too. So it seems like adding in distractors when we end up during this comparative value process makes the decision much, much more challenging in the end. But let's look at the actual choice that people made too. So the x-axis is going to be the same as before. The y-axis is now the proportion of choosing the left option. So we expect that when the left option has a dominant value, that there should be a high proportion of selecting this. And when the right option has a more dominant value, there should be a low proportion of people choosing the left option. And looking at the distractor condition, we see exactly this. There's a beautiful S-shaped curve indicating that people are choosing in line with their true, as stated, preference wantings for each food item. But to our surprise, there actually wasn't a difference here between the distractor and no distractor condition. And in fact, there was no differences in either of these data sets as well, indicating that while there might be differences in how quickly people made decisions, they're still ultimately choosing the same things that they likely would have chosen in the end between these data sets. So this is behavioral data. I'm going to quickly go through the eye tracking results as well. The first thing I want to look at was where did people look at after they looked at the attentional distractor? So below this 50-50 mark is going to indicate that people are more likely to look back at the disrupted food item, while things that are higher on the y-axis is going to indicate that things look back at the new item instead. Well, in both of these samples, we found a high probability of people looking at the new item and still looking at the disrupted food item that they only spent a small amount of time viewing. So this effect is really big and it's really exciting. There's a couple of things I've been trying to do to help understand this, and specifically understand the small number of cases where people actually return back to looking at the disrupted food item. And we want to rule out one particular possibility where perhaps this is less of an impact of distractors and more about just moving your attention. So for example, let's imagine I'm looking at the left food item. Then the left food item disappears, the central distractor comes up. I look at that. And when the food items come up again, just because I've continually just been shifting my attention over, I just look at the right food item instead. Well, so far, some early evidence does indicate that it is actually sensitive to other task factors. That's probably not the explanation here. So this is some data looking at the proportion of looking back at either new item or the old item, depending on the rating that people gave a disrupted food item. And more specifically, what we've been finding so far in some preliminary results is that people tend to look back at the disrupted food item more frequently if that rating was higher. So if it had a dominant rating over the other ones. And they're more likely to look at new items if it had a negative or neutral rating. So this is really cool because even though we are trying to give them a partial representation of that food item, it still seems like they're able to use enough of this information and gather enough about the value of it in order to influence their subsequent eye movements in some way, shape, or form. Now, last result I'm going to show is what happens between the relationship between first fixation and choice in each of these data sets. Now, in the first data set, we found that people tended to actually choose the first time that they looked at. This is really interesting, but this did not vary as a function of whether the trial was in the no distractor condition or the distractor condition. But we do see differences occur when we interrupt people during their second fixation. Here, we find that when people are distracted, there is less of a relationship between these two things. And in fact, they're equally likely to choose the first thing they look at relative to the second thing they look at. So this is some preliminary results I have from this so far. So just as a quick summary, distractors do not seem to modulate which choices people make, but they can have a negative impact upon decision speed, especially if it comes later in time with the second fixation. We found that distractors were in general more likely to shift their attention after being distracted, but this effect is modulated by the value of the disrupted food item, suggesting that they are able to process this to some extent. And that later distractors can disrupt the relationship between first fixation and choice. Our preliminary conclusions from this so far is that the timing of the distractor really matters in this condition. Where early distractors can interrupt but do not reset the decision process, as indicated by the fact that even with just 100 milliseconds into the task, they can still make, quote unquote, the correct choice, and that they are able to move their attention accordingly. However, later distractors that might be impacting more of this comparative process might have a greater negative impact upon the decision process. But this is the data I have so far at this point. I have a lot of other things I'm hoping to do in the future, but just as a quick summary, because I know that we're getting short on time, I showed you some data from 3 different studies looking at interactions between attention and reward. In the first study, I talked about the neural mechanisms underlying value-driven salience, and the results indicate that value-driven salience has unique neural mechanisms that might involve selectively increasing the strength of attentional orienting. In the second study, I looked at reward-associated disruptions and sustained spatial attention, and found that sustained spatial attention might be less susceptible to reward-related distraction. And then finally, I looked at how attention can influence decision-making, and found that attentional distractors can disrupt gaze patterns and disrupt them, especially when distractors occur later in time. With that said, I want to have some brief acknowledgements. I want to thank my graduate advisors, Marty Waldorf and Scott Hutel. A lot of this work came from, this presentation came from work done with them. And to thank my collaborators in each of these projects. I also want to thank my postdoc advisor, Sindri Hutcherson. We have some really exciting stuff that we're cooking up, and I hope that I'll have another chance to talk to you about that at some point in the future. And with that said, thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy taking questions now.